Nurses of psych wards, what did a patient do that left you speechless? Probably the saddest was a resident I had a long time ago. This gentleman was a WW2 vet with Alzheimer's and dementia. Probably once or twice a month he would relive some battle he was in. He would literally run up the hallway and grab you and yell at you to get down behind the sandbags. He would then tell you take his Thompson. Because it was too heavy for him, he would just use his pistol. Then he would get up and run back down the hallway. This guy was old, and seeing him run full sprint like that up and down the hallway during one of his episodes was surreal. I can't imagine having to constantly relive the worst moments of your life where you witnessed and survived the unspeakable horrors of war. In such a situation, would it be wrong to play along? Dealing with ALZ patients, you never tell them no. For example, if they talk about their dead family, you don't ever tell them they're dead, because they can literally go through all stages of grief, until of course they forget again. So in situations like experiencing old war scenes, you don't exactly tell them the war isn't happening, but you steer it in a softer direction. Not me, but my dad used to work in Arradale and J Ward Australian Insane Asylum and Prison for the Criminally Insane, respectively, in the 70s. He used to talk about sunny days in J Ward where they'd bring out all the inmates during a sunny day and they'd promptly line up and start jacking off. In Arradale they'd deal with the jacking off problem by strapping you into cotton mittens, but a lot of the inmates would chew a hole through them just to get a finger out to jack off with. His worst story was about a psychotic woman in Arradale. She had self-inflicted scars all over her face from scratching herself, self-imposed bite marks all over her body from trying to eat herself, and she had the nasty habit of chewing the inside of her mouth and spitting blood at your eyes and mouth hoping you'd catch one of the myriad of diseases she carried. He used to talk about sunny days in J Ward where they'd bring out all the inmates during a sunny day and they'd promptly line up and start jacking off. I swear that could have been written verbatim by Thomas Pynchon. A nurse told me one of her patients killed himself on the unit while on one suicide watch. Patient and staff were at arm's length and patient suddenly charged the wall, smashing his head as hard as he could, breaking his neck in the process. I've cut 2 patients down myself. Yeah, that'll mess you up. Is it bad that my first read of this sentence was you wielding a broadsword, charging at patients? Real talk though, that is very disturbing. I'm sorry. Coming to a psychiatric medicine conference in 2019, lowering suicide rates among inpatient populations by equipping nurses with cold steel, double dipping on jokes. Hi, you must be the new RN. You're going to love working here. Why don't you stop by human resources, and when you're through with your paperwork I'll show you to the smithy. You probably could phrase that better. Not a nurse, pharmacist. Had one of our clozapine patients miss a monthly meeting to discuss their medication. Called around, found out she was in the ICU having eaten 2 of her own fingers, then visited her mother for coffee, still bleeding. Had a friend tell me of another patient, made a cut in his thigh and reopened it regularly until the whole thing was a scar tissue cavern, by some miracle avoiding infection. Started using his meat pocket to hold pens and coins and anything he could collect in his ward. Nobody knew until a paperclip pierced the side and he finally wound up with an infection that took him to ICU where they found his stash. And all I can think of is this line from Tumblr: stab wounds. You mean extra pockets? I have a few cavities. I don't like to call them cavities, though. I like to call them places to put stuff. Mitch Hedberg. Not a nurse, but I was a patient in a psych ward. The ward was sectioned into 2 sides, based on case severity. I was on the less severe side. One night, an incredibly tall, somewhat muscular man escaped his room on the severe side, got through a door that was supposed to be locked, got into the less severe side, and into my room. I woke up, sat up, and saw him standing in my doorway. He asked in a shaky voice if I was alright. I hesitantly said yes, to which he responded by getting a look of terrified horror and screamed, "I knew it. You can see them too. Don't let them get you," before he was dragged away screaming by security. Guess you're a protagonist now. This comment amused me far more than it should have. I'd gild it if I wasn't a broke college student bedemptis. Nursing student here. Also not my story. A friend of mine that is a nurse in a psychiatric hospital Some context: some of the patients were outside sitting in the benches and walking around, and she was walking with some other patient. There was a patient standing by a door. Dude is like 200 kg, 450 ibs. Actual story: a skinny guy was smoking and just minded his own business when out of the blue he starts running and just spears the 200 kg guy into the door like a steel and glass door, and then just walks out of there like he does nothing. Big dude got a broken skull, a dislocated shoulder and some minor injuries. Skinny dude got nothing. I don't know what triggered the dude to throw himself at a dude 3-4 times larger than him. Note: English is not my native language, so sorry for grammar and spelling mistakes. Psych ward counselor here. Early in my career I had a teenage girl with suicidal ideations and severe depression. The year before, on Thanksgiving, her dad pulled a gun from under the dinner table and blew his brains out in front of everyone. I normally form a response pretty quickly, even a wow, but when she told me I got quiet, leaned back, exhaled, and had to gather my thoughts. I wonder what made him do that. I mean, I vaguely understand feeling suicidal, but making the family watch. Not a psychiatrist, but my best guess is that it was his way of telling them that he thinks it was their fault, and they drove him to this. Yeah, it almost sounds like the final act of a narcissistic abuser. Look at what you made me do. I shouldn't have to suffer alone. My sister was actually sectioned earlier this year for her eating disorder. She shouldn't have been, but that's a story for another time, and she was right next to the PICU psychiatric intensive care unit. One of the nights she heard multiple screams coming specifically from that ward. One of the patients had bit a chunk out of a nurse's leg as they were trying to detain them. They then started eating said chunk. It's crazy to think these types of things happen. Sorry guys, I typed psychiatric instead of pediatric. She was only 15, so it was PICU. I just had a bit of a brain confusion. Sounds like they too had an eating disorder. That made me gasp and then chuckle. Have an upvote. Don't laugh. I hate it when my patients nurse their food. What about fooding their nurse? I was a CNA for about 4 years, and the saddest ever was my client resident constantly thought I was her daughter. She went to Harvard and was an extremely brilliant lady in her time. She was nonverbal, but every time I walked into her room she would exclaim, "Elizabeth, you came." I loved this lady so much. She would only eat when I fed her. She was extremely combative with everyone but me. I ended up quitting my job there, but visited her every single day, to the point that her family kind of accepted me as their family. I finally found out that Elizabeth took her own life at 21, and the fact that she thought I was her gave her extreme joy. I never corrected her, and I like to think I gave her peace when she passed holding my hand. She was an amazing lady, and I miss her to this day. Got assigned to child psych ward in a hospital where I worked. Easy gig, wear street clothes, not much to do, but pass out meds, and observe 15-year-old black kid, overweight, is sitting beside me casually discussing his day, when he jumps up, begins screaming like a banshee, flailing around, looks like a seizure on roids, and I'm befuddled as to how to control him, or the situation, when after a few minutes of twisting my nerves into a tight ball, he stops, sits back down, and begins talking casually again. Had one of his spells. Not sure if anyone has ever been that close to a raving maniac while he's having a fit, but it's disarming to say the least. I don't think disarming is the correct word here, lol. Going to go a different route here, as all of the stories seem to focus on the shocking and negative challenging behaviors. I'm not a nurse, but am a support worker. We currently have a patient who, when he was admitted, was extremely aggressive, not physically, and impatient. He was unable to wait for anything for longer than 2 seconds, barely spoke to anybody unless it was on a needs basis, and couldn't do anything for himself. Fast forward 6 weeks, and he has stopped me in my tracks multiple times. The first time he said please when he asked for something. The first time he agreed to make his breakfast himself. The first time he asked how I was when he saw me. And probably the most rewarding of all was when he smiled at me and said good morning. One of our patients escaped the ward and managed to hitchhike all the way to Sydney, about 900 kilometers. And this is why I don't pick up hitchhikers. In Australia, where you shouldn't pick up anything. Even this adorable koala rolling around all playful licky augh. Not there. NOOOO. Gotta watch out for those drop bears. My grandmother worked in a nursing home years back. I remember driving with her the next town over and seeing one of the patients walking down the street in hospital gown that escaped. It is amazing how much energy a 80-year-old dementia patient has. We would put the patient in the car and drive him back to the nursing home. We had a gero psych floor. Crazy old people. One night while passing through, a little old lady popped her head out her doorway and said to me I could sure use the company of a good looking young man tonight. Sorry, I'm not that good looking. Quick as snot on a doorknob, she said. That's okay. I can't see too well. I didn't join her, but her charisma was on point. Sounds like you're the one who missed out in this story. Sorry, but I just want to draw some attention to this. Quick as snot on a doorknob, impeccable. I'm checking doorknobs from now on. I walked into one's room one night and she told me she's never been with a black man before, so I would have to teach her. I'm very white. I visited a prison for a warden job and went to see the constant surveillance guys for their own safety etc. There was a fella there who had used a razor to slice his stomach open and started pulling chunks of himself out for fun. He also started using the hole, which wouldn't heal, as a hiding place. A towel was found stuffed in there which his body had started fusing to. Apparently he was quite nice, but the whole thing wasn't for me, and I didn't go ahead with applying. For those posting Arthafap, and I suggest reading this topic and doing research on what seriously ill patients can do to themselves if you think I'd make this up. Bleh. Fused to. Okay, that's enough Reddit for today. My sister-in-law is finishing her nursing degree and they had to spend a couple days working at some psych wards. She told me a story about these two guys there that were schizophrenic and violent. One was the skinny little white guy and the other was a medium-built black guy. The black guy kept telling her that he wasn't crazy, that he was actually the owner of the ward and just stayed there for fun. He also told her he had a record label. So then she goes and meets the white guy. According to him, he was an up-and-coming rapper who was such a threat to Eminem's career that the deep state had him locked away, and that the psych ward owner was his new record label. Fun times.